Millionaire breaks down in tears when he sees Waitress wearing necklace he gifted his late wife. Maxwell Reed's world collapsed in the space between heartbeats. The crystal glass of 30-year-old scotch froze halfway to his lips as his eyes locked onto the delicate silver chain around the waitress's neck. Suspended from it, catching the dim restaurant lighting in a way that seemed to mock him personally, hung a sapphire pendant shaped like a teardrop, a perfect match to Elena's eyes. His Elena. His wife. His presumed dead wife. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Sir, is everything all right with your steak? The waitress, her name tag read Ava, leaned forward with professional concern, causing the pendant to swing slightly. Maxwell couldn't breathe. The air in Le Ciel, Boston's most exclusive restaurant, suddenly felt as thin as the atmosphere atop the financial empire he'd built. A crushing weight pressed against his chest as 15 years of memories cascaded through him like a breaking dam. That necklace. His voice emerged as a whisper, unfamiliar even to himself. Where did you get it? Ava's hand flew reflexively to the pendant, her brow furrowing. This? It was a gift from someone who changed my life. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, but her eyes narrowed with sudden suspicion. Why do you ask? The other diners, CEOs, politicians, old money Bostonians who normally clamored for his attention, faded into indistinct shapes as Maxwell's vision tunneled. The restaurant's ambient noises disappeared beneath the thundering of his pulse. I gave that necklace to my wife on our wedding day. His voice cracked as something long buried within him fractured wide open. She's been gone for 3 years. Gone. Not dead. He'd never been able to bring himself to say the word dead, even after he'd paid for the headstone that bore her name in the cemetery overlooking the harbor. Even after the courts had declared her legally deceased when no trace of her could be found. Ava's expression softened momentarily before hardening again. She'd seen men like Maxwell Reed before, powerful men who thought they owned everything they touched. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Reed, but this necklace was given to me freely. I didn't steal it. Her chin lifted slightly, a subtle act of defiance that reminded Maxwell, strangely, of Elena. I don't think you stole it, he said, his voice steadying despite the trembling in his hands. I need to know who gave it to you. Please. Something in his tone, the raw desperation, perhaps, made Ava pause. She studied him, seeing for the first time beyond the bespoke suit and commanding presence to the broken man beneath. She never told me her name, Ava finally said. It was 3 years ago, when my son and I were living out of my car. She was well-dressed, beautiful, with the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. She said the necklace had once symbolized hope for her, and she wanted it to do the same for me. Maxwell closed his eyes as pain lanced through him. Elena had been alive 3 years ago. She hadn't drowned herself in the harbor as his darkest fears had suggested. She hadn't been abducted as the police had theorized. She had walked away, had given away the one thing he thought she'd never part with. When was this exactly? Where? The questions tumbled from him as restaurant patrons began to stare. Maxwell Reed, Boston's coldest business tycoon, was visibly unraveling at a corner table. Late October, 3 years ago, near South Station, I was trying to stay warm inside the terminal with my 4-year-old. Ava's voice softened with the memory. She sat with us for hours, listening to my story. Before she left, she gave me the necklace and enough money to get an apartment for 3 months, said it was time for someone else to have a fresh start. October, just days after their final argument. The image of Elena's face that night burned in Maxwell's memory, her features tight with disappointment as he'd canceled their anniversary dinner for the 3rd consecutive year. The next morning, she was gone, her closet half empty, her jewelry left behind except for the sapphire necklace he'd noticed missing weeks later. Did she say where she was going? Maxwell asked, desperate now. She mentioned a new job in Chicago. Said she was starting over. Chicago. The opportunity he'd dismissed as insignificant when Elena had brought it up. It's just a middle management position, Elena, he'd said dismissively while reviewing quarterly projections. Why would you want that when you have everything here? A single tear escaped Maxwell's tightly controlled facade, tracing a path down his cheek like a confession. The enormity of his arrogance crashed down upon him, a weight heavier than all his wealth combined. Sir, are you okay? Ava asked, genuine concern replacing her earlier wariness. Maxwell wasn't okay. He hadn't been okay for 3 years. But now, for the first time since Elena's disappearance, a tiny ember of hope flickered in the wasteland of his heart. She's alive, he whispered more to himself than to Ava, his throat constricted around emotions he'd long suppressed. She's alive, and I need to find her. The waitress's eyes widened. You thought she was dead all this time? I did everything to find her. Private investigators, police reports, rewards. His voice faltered. After a year with no trace, I had to accept what everyone was telling me, that she was gone forever. What Maxwell couldn't articulate was how that acceptance had been tinged with guilt, the unshakable knowledge that Elena's disappearance was his fault, that his transformation from the passionate, idealistic man she'd married into a cold, success-driven stranger had driven her away. The woman I met didn't seem like someone who wanted to be found, Ava said gently. Maxwell nodded, the truth of those words piercing him. The Elena he'd known, the woman who had once looked at him with boundless love, had chosen to disappear from his life completely, had chosen to start anew without a single memento of their life together, save the necklace she'd eventually given away. I have to try, he said, his voice steadying with resolve. I need to tell her I'm sorry, that I understand now what I couldn't see then. As he spoke these words, Maxwell Reed, who had built his reputation on calculated decisions and emotional detachment, felt something shift within him. The tears came freely now, streaming down his face as years of suppressed grief finally found release. In the middle of Boston's most exclusive restaurant, surrounded by the elite social circle that had replaced genuine human connection in his life, Maxwell Reed broke down completely as he realized the true cost of his success. And Ava, witnessing this raw display of emotion from a man known for his steely composure, made a decision that would alter both their lives irrevocably. I think, she said quietly, I might be able to help you find her. The air in Maxwell's penthouse felt stale and empty as he moved through its pristine spaces later that night. His footsteps echoed across Italian marble as he made his way to the wall of windows overlooking Boston Harbor, the same harbor where police had dragged with hooks and nets, searching for Elena's body 3 years ago. Had he known then what he knew now, what would he have done differently? His reflection stared back at him from the glass, a successful man by all external measures. At 45, Maxwell Reed had accumulated more wealth than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. Reed Technologies had revolutionized medical data systems, saving countless lives while making him obscenely rich in the process. But money couldn't buy back time. It couldn't undo the slow erosion of his marriage. Maxwell pressed his forehead against the cool glass, eyes closing as memories washed over him. Not memories of boardrooms and acquisition deals, but of the tiny apartment they'd shared 15 years ago when he was still a graduate student with big dreams, and Elena was the only person who believed in them. Where did we go wrong? He whispered to the ghost of his former self. The answer hung heavy in the silence. They hadn't gone wrong. He had. Maxwell turned away from the window and moved to his study, a room Elena had never seen. He'd purchased this penthouse 2 years after her disappearance, unable to live in their home with its echoing absence. His fingers trailed across the sleek desk before he unlocked the bottom drawer and removed a worn leather box. Inside lay the only photograph of Elena he'd kept visible, their wedding day. Her smile radiated a joy so pure it physically hurt him to look at it now. Her neck had been bare that day until he'd surprised her with the necklace at their reception. He remembered her tears as he'd clasped it around her neck, remembered her whispered words. "I don't need expensive things, Max. I just need you." How tragically prophetic those words had become. His phone vibrated, pulling him from the memory. It was a text from an unknown number. "This is Ava from the restaurant. If you're serious about finding her, meet me tomorrow at 9 a.m. South Station, Main Hall." Maxwell typed back immediately, "I'll be there. Thank you." Sleep evaded him that night as he relived the transformation that had cost him everything. How had the passionate visionary who wanted to improve healthcare become the cutthroat CEO whose calendar had no room for his own wife? The changes had been so gradual he'd never noticed them happening. A missed dinner here, a canceled vacation there, irritation replacing patience, ambition superseding love. The morning found him bleary-eyed but determined. For the first time in years, Maxwell dressed in jeans and a simple sweater rather than his customary suit. He dismissed his driver, choosing instead to walk the familiar streets that led to South Station. The main hall buzzed with commuter energy when he arrived. People rushing to trains, tourists consulting maps, the endless flow of humanity moving in all directions. It reminded him of his own relentless forward momentum, always driving toward some future goal without ever appreciating the present moment. Ava stood near the information desk, almost unrecognizable in street clothes instead of her waitress uniform. Beside her stood a young boy of about 7, his small hand clasped firmly in hers. The child's presence surprised Maxwell, though he realized it shouldn't have after her mention of a son yesterday. "You look different," Ava said by way of greeting. "So do you." Maxwell offered a tentative smile. "Thank you for meeting me." Ava nodded toward a nearby bench. "This is where I met her. My son and I had been sleeping in our car for weeks after my ex cleaned out our bank account and disappeared. That morning, the car wouldn't start. We came here because it was warm." The young boy looked up at Maxwell with curious eyes. "Are you the man who's looking for the angel lady?" Maxwell crouched down to the child's level. "The angel lady?" "That's what Liam calls her," Ava explained. "He was 4 then, but he remembers her. Says she had sad eyes but a kind smile. She gave me a hot chocolate with extra marshmallows," Liam added solemnly. "And she told Mommy that sometimes we have to leave behind what we love to find what we need." Maxwell's breath caught. Those words, they were so perfectly Elena. She'd been a child psychologist before their marriage, before he'd convinced her that her talents were wasted on modest pay when she could join his company instead. "Did she say anything else? About where she might be going in Chicago?" Maxwell asked, trying to keep the desperation from his voice. Ava shook her head. "Not specifically, but I have this." She pulled a small card from her pocket. "She gave me her email address. Said if I ever needed help I could reach out. I did, once, about a year after we met." She responded, but the message came from a university address. Maxwell took the card with trembling fingers. The email was unfamiliar, a generic address that could belong to anyone. But the handwriting on the card was unmistakably Elena's, with its distinctive loop on the capital E. "Northwestern University," he read aloud. A familiar pain twisted in his chest. "She always wanted to get her Ph.D. in developmental psychology. I told her it was impractical." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd dismissed her dreams as impractical while pouring millions into his own vision. What kind of husband did that make him? "This is recent," Ava said, pulling out her phone and showing Maxwell an email dated just 3 months ago. She asked how Liam was doing in school, said she was glad the necklace had brought us luck. Hope surged through Maxwell's veins like an electric current. Not only was Elena alive, but she was established somewhere, thinking occasionally of the woman and child she'd helped. It was more than he deserved to know, but less than he desperately needed. She never mentioned me? The question felt pathetic on his lips. Ava hesitated, her expression softening with what might have been pity. She didn't talk about her past at all. But when Liam asked why she looked sad, she said she was leaving behind a life that no longer fit who she'd become. The words struck Maxwell with physical force. A life that no longer fit. Had he changed so much, or had she? Or had they simply grown in different directions, his path paved with ambition while hers remained rooted in compassion? I need to find her, he said, resolve strengthening his voice. Not to reclaim what we had. I understand now that's gone. But to apologize. To let her know I finally understand what I did wrong. Ava studied him intently, as if measuring the sincerity of his words. The woman I met wasn't bitter, Mr. Reed. She seemed at peace with her decision, despite her sadness. Are you sure finding her is what's best for her, and not just for you? The question landed like a blow. Maxwell hadn't considered that his sudden reappearance might disrupt whatever new life Elena had built. Was his desire to find her ultimately another act of selfishness? Before he could respond, Liam tugged at his mother's sleeve. Mommy, show him the picture. Ava's expression registered surprise. What picture, sweetie? The one the angel lady is in. On your computer, from the newspaper. Confusion flickered across Ava's features before understanding dawned. Oh, I forgot about that. It was an article about a child psychology program. I noticed it because I recognized her. New hope surged through Maxwell. Can you show me? I'll have to look for it at home, but... She paused, clearly still wrestling with whether helping him was the right thing to do. Finally, she nodded. I'll send it to you if I find it. Give me your number. As they exchanged contact information, Maxwell felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest. Not the driven determination that had built his empire, but a humbler kind of resolve. For the first time in years, he was pursuing something more valuable than profit margins and market share. He was pursuing redemption. The photograph arrived in Maxwell's email 3 days later with a simple message from Ava. Found it. Good luck. Maxwell's hand trembled as he clicked the attachment. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, as if the universe itself was testing his patience. Then there she was, Elena, standing in a group of academics beneath a banner reading Northwestern University Child Resilience Program. His breath caught painfully in his chest. Elena's hair was shorter now, styled in a practical bob instead of the long waves he remembered. She looked thinner, her features more defined. But what struck him most forcefully was her smile, genuine and relaxed in a way he hadn't seen in the final years of their marriage. She looked happy. Without him? Maxwell leaned back in his chair, emotions warring within him. Should he be grateful she had found contentment? Or devastated that she had achieved it only by excising him from her life completely? The office door opened, startling him from his thoughts. His executive assistant, David, entered with the day's schedule and a stack of contracts requiring his signature. The Tokyo investors are waiting in the conference room, David said, his tone indicating this was a repetition. Sir, did you hear me? Maxwell stared at him blankly. Cancel it. I'm sorry. Cancel the meeting. Cancel everything for the next week. Maxwell stood, sudden clarity washing over him. I'm going to Chicago. David's normally impassive face registered shock. Sir, these investors have flown halfway around the world specifically to meet with you. The board will survive without me for a few days, Maxwell interrupted, already reaching for his coat. Have Jonathan handle the Tokyo group. He's been ready for more responsibility. Mr. Reed, is everything all right? Genuine concern colored David's usually professional tone. In 10 years, he had never seen his boss act so impulsively. Maxwell paused, looking at his assistant as if truly seeing him for the first time. How many birthdays and holidays had this man sacrificed to accommodate Maxwell's relentless work schedule? How many times had he rearranged Maxwell's life while putting his own on hold? "No, David, everything is not all right," Maxwell answered honestly. "But I'm hoping it might be someday. Take next week off. Paid, of course. Spend it with your family." Before David could respond, Maxwell was out the door, purpose driving each step. Within hours, he was on a private jet bound for Chicago, Elena's image open on his tablet as he tried to prepare what he would say to her after 3 years of absence. Every rehearsed speech felt hollow. What could possibly encapsulate the remorse that had become his constant companion? What words could bridge the chasm he had created? The Northwestern campus sprawled before him like a small city the following morning. Maxwell felt conspicuously out of place among the students hustling between classes. He had opted for casual clothes again, a deliberate choice to leave behind the armor of wealth and status he typically wore. Finding the psychology department proved easier than steeling his nerves to approach the administrative assistant at the front desk. "I'm looking for Dr. Elena Reed," he said, the name feeling both familiar and foreign on his tongue. The woman eyed him curiously. "There's no one by that name here." Of course, Elena would have reverted to her maiden name or possibly taken an entirely new identity. Maxwell fumbled for his phone, pulling up the photo Ava had sent. This woman, she works with the Child Resilience Program. Recognition dawned on the assistant's face. "Oh, you mean Dr. Elena Winters, 3rd floor, East Wing, but she's teaching until 11. Winters. Not her maiden name, which had been Sullivan. A completely new identity then. The knowledge struck Maxwell like a physical blow. She had erased every trace of their life together, even her name. Rather than waiting in the sterile department lobby, Maxwell found himself wandering the campus, eventually settling on a bench overlooking a small pond. The autumn air carried a crisp edge that matched his internal state. A season of change with winter's reckoning approaching. His phone vibrated with what had to be the 20th call from his office. Maxwell silenced it without looking. For the first time in years, the world beyond his immediate task seemed distant and unimportant. At precisely 10 minutes past 11, Maxwell returned to the psychology building and made his way to the 3rd floor. Students streamed from a classroom, chatting animatedly about developmental psychology theories, and then, gathering papers at the lectern, was Elena. Maxwell froze in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. In his imagination, this moment had played out dramatically, their eyes meeting across a crowded room, time standing still. The reality was more mundane. Elena hadn't noticed him yet, focused as she was on collecting her materials. He could still walk away. Let her continue the life she had built without the complication of his reappearance. But before he could decide, Elena looked up. Those sapphire eyes, the same color as the necklace that had led him here, widened in shock. The papers in her hands scattered to the floor as her body went rigid. "Maxwell!" His name emerged as a whisper, her voice unchanged by the years apart. "Hello, Elena?" He remained in the doorway, afraid to approach without invitation. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." A strangled laugh escaped her. "Disturbing me? 3 years of silence and that's what you say? That you hope you're not disturbing me?" Her words held no anger, only disbelief. Maxwell took a tentative step into the room. "I thought you were dead," he said softly. "Everyone did." Elena's expression shifted through multiple emotions. Shock, confusion, and finally understanding. "You declared me dead?" "After a year of searching with no trace, the courts did." Maxwell swallowed hard. "I never stopped looking, but eventually I had to accept what everyone told me, that you were gone forever." Elena sank into her chair, her professional composure crumbling. "I left you a letter. in your desk drawer, explaining everything. The revelation hit Maxwell like a thunderbolt. There was no letter. I put it in the right drawer of your home office desk, the one you always kept locked. Elena's voice hardened slightly. Though I suppose you were rarely home long enough to check it. The implications cascaded through Maxwell's mind. The drawer where he kept personal documents. The drawer his executive assistant had access to for managing his personal affairs. The same assistant who had helped him search for Elena after her disappearance. Had David found the letter and concealed it? Or had it simply been overlooked in the chaos following her disappearance? "I never found any letter," Maxwell said, his mind still reeling from the possibility. "I came home and half your clothes were gone. No note, no message. Just emptiness." Something flickered in Elena's eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or the first crack in whatever narrative she had constructed around their separation. "Why are you here, Maxwell? How did you find me?" "A waitress in Boston was wearing your necklace." His voice caught. "The sapphire teardrop. I recognized it immediately." Understanding dawned on Elena's face. "Ava," she said softly, "and her little boy." Maxwell nodded. "She told me how you helped them, how you gave her the necklace and enough money for an apartment." "She needed it more than I did," Elena said simply. The classroom stood empty now except for them, the silence heavy with unspoken words and lost years. Through the windows, sunlight illuminated dust motes dancing in the air between them, a visible manifestation of the particles of their shared history, suspended and unresolved. "You built a new life," Maxwell observed, gesturing to the classroom. "You finally got your Ph.D. A small smile touched Elena's lips. "I did. Turns out I wasn't so impractical after all." The gentle barb found its mark. Maxwell accepted it without defense. "You were right about so many things, Elena. I was just too blinded by ambition to see it." She studied him with the analytical gaze of a psychologist, looking for deception or manipulation. Finding none, her shoulders relaxed slightly. "What do you want from me, Maxwell? Why track me down after all this time?" It was the question he had prepared for, yet all his rehearsed answers evaporated in her presence. All that remained was the simple truth. "To apologize," he said finally, "not to ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, just to tell you that I understand now what I couldn't see then, that I'm sorry for who I became and what it cost us." For the first time since he'd entered the room, Elena's clinical detachment wavered. Her eyes glistened with unexpected tears. "It's a little late for that, don't you think?" she whispered. "It's a little late for that, don't you think?" Elena's words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of lost years. Maxwell couldn't argue with her assessment. He remained still, accepting her judgment without defense. "Yes," he agreed quietly. "It is too late for many things. But I needed you to know that I finally understand what happened to us. To me." Elena gathered the scattered papers from the floor, her movements precise and controlled, a physical manifestation of the emotional walls she had built. "And what exactly do you think happened to us, Maxwell?" The question wasn't merely rhetorical. Her eyes held genuine curiosity. What insights had his years of presumed widowhood granted him? "I became someone else," he said simply. "Someone you never agreed to marry. I convinced myself that building the company was for us, for our future. But it was always for me, for my ego, my ambition. I told myself I was working for you, but I never listened to what you actually wanted." A small, sad smile touched Elena's lips. "That's a remarkably self-aware assessment for someone who once told me that my desire to work with underprivileged children was wasting my potential." The memory of those carelessly spoken words made Maxwell wince. "I was wrong. About that, and so many other things." Elena checked her watch. "I have another class in 20 minutes. It was a dismissal, gentle but firm. Maxwell nodded, understanding he had no right to demand more of her time. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card, not his usual embossed corporate card, but a simple one with just his personal number. "If you ever want to talk again, about anything." Elena took the card reflexively but didn't look at it. "I built this life carefully, Maxwell. It took time to find myself again after disappearing into your shadow for so many years." "I know." He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold. "I'm staying at the Drake for a few days. If you want to know more about how I found you, or anything else." With that, he left, not allowing himself to look back, though every cell in his body urged him to. Outside the building, the autumn air felt sharper than before, the colors of the campus more vivid. For the first time in years, Maxwell felt fully present in a moment, not rushing toward the next meeting or acquisition, not avoiding painful memories. His phone vibrated again. 27 missed calls now. The world he had built was likely in an uproar at his unexpected disappearance. For once, Maxwell couldn't bring himself to care. He walked aimlessly across campus, eventually finding himself at a small coffee shop crowded with students. The normalcy of the scene struck him forcefully. Young people laughing, studying, living in the moment. How long had it been since he'd experienced such ordinary pleasures? "You look lost." The voice startled him. Maxwell turned to find a young man with a backpack slung over one shoulder. "Sorry," the student said, "but you've been standing in the same spot for 5 minutes looking at nothing. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Maxwell replied automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, no. I'm not fine. But thank you for asking." The student nodded as if this made perfect sense and continued on his way. Such a simple human interaction, a moment of concern from a stranger, and yet it affected Maxwell profoundly. When was the last time anyone had asked if he was okay and actually waited for an honest answer? Back at his hotel, Maxwell found himself staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man who gazed back at him looked haggard, the lines around his eyes deeper than he remembered. This face had appeared in business magazines and news programs, labeled as brilliant, ruthless, innovative. Never kind, never compassionate. Is that how Elena had seen him in those final years? A knock at his suite door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it expecting hotel staff, but found Elena standing in the hallway instead. "I had to see your face when I asked this," she said without preamble. "Did you really not know I was alive until 3 days ago?" Maxwell stepped back, inviting her in with a gesture. "I wouldn't lie about that, Elena." She entered cautiously, remaining near the door as if planning a quick escape. "You hired investigators. They never found any trace of me?" "Nothing. No credit card usage, no social media, no employment records under your name. It was as if you'd vanished." He hesitated, then added, "The police speculated that you might have taken your own life. Given the state of our marriage." Elena's eyes widened. "You actually thought I committed suicide?" "I didn't want to believe it," Maxwell said quietly, "but after months of searching with no results, it seemed increasingly possible. You were unhappy. I knew that much, even if I never acknowledged it." Elena moved to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "I left the letter explaining everything. It said I was accepting the position at Northwestern, that I needed space to figure out who I was apart from you and your company, that I would contact you when I was ready." "I never saw any letter," Maxwell repeated. "I came home that night and found your closet half empty. I called your friends, your family. No one knew anything, or at least that's what they told me." Elena turned back to him, her expression troubled. "My mother knew. And Sarah, from my old practice." Confusion creased her brow. "They never told you?" "Your mother refused to speak to me after the first month. She blamed me for your disappearance. Sarah said she hadn't heard from you since we moved your practice into the Reed Technologies building." A heavy silence fell between them as they both absorbed the implications. People had chosen sides, created narratives, acted on assumptions. "I did try to call you," Elena said finally, 6 months after I left. "Your number had been changed." "The company changed all executive numbers after a security breach." Maxwell ran a hand through his hair. "Elena, if I had known you were trying to reach me—" "Would it have mattered?" she challenged. "You were already pulling away long before I left. I spent our last anniversary alone while you closed the Westbrook acquisition. You missed my father's funeral because the Tokyo office had a crisis. I became an afterthought in your life, Maxwell." The truth of her words cut deeply. "You're right," he admitted. "I can't pretend I was the husband you deserved, even before you left. I put everything else first. The company, the next deal, the endless expansion." Elena studied him, her professional training evident in her analytical gaze. "What changed? Why are you here now, saying all the things I needed to hear 3 years ago?" Maxwell moved to the minibar and poured a glass of water, offering one to Elena, who declined with a shake of her head. His throat felt suddenly parched. "Losing you changed me," he said after taking a sip. "Not immediately. At first, I threw myself even deeper into work, but eventually I realized I'd sacrificed the only thing that truly mattered on the altar of success." Elena's eyes narrowed skeptically. "That sounds suspiciously like the plots of those Christmas movies I used to watch while you were working late." A surprised laugh escaped him. "I deserved that, but it's true, even if it sounds trite." He set down his glass. "Seeing that necklace around the waitress's neck, it broke something in me, Elena. Some final wall I'd built to protect myself from how badly I'd failed us." "The necklace." Elena's hand moved reflexively to her throat, touching the place where the sapphire had once rested. "I almost kept it. It was the only thing of ours I wanted to take with me." "Why did you give it away?" Maxwell asked, genuinely curious. Elena's expression softened at the memory. "Ava reminded me of myself before we met. Struggling, but determined. When I saw her with her little boy in that train station, something just clicked. The necklace was a symbol of hope for me once. I wanted it to be that for her too." Maxwell nodded, understanding the gesture in a way his former self never could have. "It was. She told me it changed her life." A small smile touched Elena's lips. "I'm glad." She glanced at her watch again. "I should go. I have student appointments this afternoon." "Thank you for coming," Maxwell said. "I know you didn't have to." Elena paused at the door. "I spent a long time being angry with you, Maxwell, then even longer trying to forget you. Neither worked particularly well." She met his eyes directly. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel now that you're suddenly back in my life." "You don't owe me anything, Elena. Not your time, not your forgiveness, certainly not your feelings." She regarded him for a long moment. "Have dinner with me tomorrow night," she said finally. "There's more we should discuss. Things you don't know about what happened after I left." With that cryptic statement, she was gone, leaving Maxwell with more questions than answers and a fragile hope he scarcely dared to examine too closely. The restaurant Elena chose for their dinner was not what Maxwell had expected. Rather than one of Chicago's upscale establishments, she had selected a modest Italian place tucked away on a tree-lined street. The interior was warm and inviting, filled with the aromas of garlic and fresh bread, the walls adorned with photos of an extended family spanning generations. Maxwell arrived 15 minutes early, nervousness propelling him through his day. He'd spent the intervening hours in his hotel room making long-overdue calls, to his board explaining his absence, to David clarifying that he needed time for personal matters, to his attorney to begin investigating whether someone had deliberately kept Elena's letter from him. The maitre d' led him to a corner table set for two. Elena hadn't arrived yet, giving Maxwell time to observe the families and couples around him. Their easy laughter and intimate conversations highlighted what had been missing from his life for so long: genuine human connection. When Elena appeared at the entrance, Maxwell stood instinctively. She had changed from her professional attire into a simple navy dress, her short hair framing her face in a way that accentuated her eyes. Those sapphire eyes that had once looked at him with unconditional love, now guarded and assessing. "This place has the best risotto outside of Italy," she said as she sat, skipping conventional greetings. "You always did have an unerring radar for good food," Maxwell replied, a small smile touching his lips at the memory of Elena dragging him to hole-in-the-wall restaurants during their early years together. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "You remember that?" "I remember everything, Elena." The words emerged more intensely than he'd intended. "Every birthday, every anniversary, every milestone I missed. Every time I chose work over you." The waiter arrived before she could respond, saving them both from the sudden emotional current. They ordered with minimal discussion. Elena recommended the risotto for Maxwell while choosing the eggplant parmesan for herself. A bottle of Chianti completed their order. When they were alone again, Elena folded her hands on the table. "Before we go further, I need to know something. What are you expecting from this, Maxwell? From finding me again?" It was the same question she'd asked in her classroom, but the context had shifted. Then she had been caught off guard, defensive. Now she was deliberately creating space for this conversation, suggesting she needed, to understand his intentions. "I don't have expectations," Maxwell answered honestly. "When I boarded that plane to Chicago, I only knew I had to see you. To apologize. Nothing beyond that." Elena studied him with those perceptive eyes. "And now, sitting across from me in this restaurant?" Maxwell considered his response carefully, knowing his answer mattered more than perhaps any business negotiation he'd ever conducted. "Now, I want to understand," he said finally. "I want to know what happened to you after you left Boston. I want to understand who you've become, not to reclaim the past or force my way into your future, just to know that you're well, that leaving was the right choice for you." The wine arrived, giving Elena time to process his words. The waiter poured 2 glasses with practiced efficiency and retreated again. She took a deliberate sip before responding. "After I left Boston, I didn't go directly to Chicago," she began, her voice measured. "I needed time to think, to separate myself from who I'd become during our marriage. So I drove west with no particular destination." She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. "I ended up in a small town outside Denver, rented a cabin for a month. It was October, and the aspens were changing. I'd wake up each morning to this explosion of gold outside my window." A sad smile touched her lips. "I kept thinking how I wanted to share it with you. Even after everything, that was my first instinct." The admission pierced Maxwell's heart. "What happened then?" "I tried to call you, as I mentioned yesterday. When I couldn't reach you, I called the office. Your assistant." "David," Maxwell supplied. Elena nodded. "David told me you were in Tokyo closing a major acquisition and couldn't be disturbed, that you'd be unreachable for the next week." Her eyes met his. "I asked him to tell you I called, to have you call me back. He said he would." Maxwell's jaw tightened. The Tokyo deal, he remembered it well. The crown jewel of Reed Technologies' Asian expansion. At the time, it had seemed critically important. Now, it felt meaningless compared to what he'd lost. "He never gave me that message," Maxwell said quietly. "I suspected as much when months passed with no word from you." Elena took another sip of wine. "After Denver, I came to Chicago to interview for the position here. I was still using my married name then. It wasn't until I was offered the job that I made the clean break. New name, new bank accounts, new email. The works. Why Winters? Maxwell couldn't help asking. Of all the names you could have chosen. Something flickered in Elena's eyes. A memory, perhaps. It was snowing the day I arrived in Chicago to start my new life. It seemed appropriate. Their food arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. Maxwell found himself with little appetite despite the exquisite aroma of the risotto before him. Every new piece of Elena's story made the weight of his failures heavier. You mentioned yesterday there were things I don't know, Maxwell prompted after they had both taken a few bites, about what happened after you left. Elena set down her fork, her expression turning serious. Yes, there's something significant you need to know, Maxwell. She took a deep breath as if steeling herself. 2 months after I left Boston, I discovered I was pregnant. The world around Maxwell seemed to stop. The ambient restaurant noise faded to silence as her words echoed in his mind. Pregnant. Elena had been carrying their child. We have. His voice failed him. He tried again. We have a child? The pain that flashed across Elena's face told him everything before she even spoke. No, she said softly. I lost the baby at 14 weeks, a complication no one could have prevented. Maxwell felt the breath leave his body as if he'd been struck. Grief for a child he'd never known existed washed over him with surprising force. You were alone, he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. When it happened, you were alone. Elena nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. I was, but the doctor who treated me was kind. She helped me through the worst of it. Why didn't you reach out then? I would have come immediately. Nothing would have kept me away. The words tumbled out before Maxwell could consider them. Would you? Elena challenged gently. The Maxwell I knew then lived for his company. Would he really have dropped everything for a wife who'd left him and a pregnancy he didn't know about? The question hung between them, impossible to answer with certainty. The man he was then and the man he had become were separated by an ocean of grief and regret. I'd like to think so, Maxwell said finally, but I can't honestly say for sure. I was someone else then. Elena nodded, accepting his candor. That's why I'm telling you now, because the man sitting across from me might actually hear what I'm saying. They ate in silence for several minutes, both processing the weight of her revelation. Maxwell struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what Elena had endured alone, leaving her husband, losing their child, rebuilding her entire identity. His own grief seemed small in comparison. I'm so sorry, Elena, he said eventually, the words wholly inadequate for the depth of his feeling. Not just for your loss, our loss. For everything you went through alone. For being the kind of husband you couldn't turn to when you needed someone most. Elena reached across the table and, for the first time since their reunion, touched his hand briefly. I've had 3 years to process all of this, Maxwell. Time helps. So does my work. Helping children who've experienced trauma gives meaning to everything. The simple touch of her fingers against his sent a current through Maxwell's body. Not desire, but a deeper recognition of what they had once meant to each other. What they had lost. Can I ask you something else? He ventured. At her nod, he continued. The letter you left? What exactly did it say? Elena leaned back, considering. It explained that I needed space to find myself again, that I felt I was disappearing into your shadow, becoming an appendage to your success rather than your partner. I said I was taking the position at Northwestern and would contact you when I had some clarity. She paused. I also wrote that I still loved you, but couldn't continue living the way we were. The revelation that her letter had contained not just an explanation, but also a declaration of continued love pierced Maxwell's carefully constructed defenses. For 3 years, He had lived with the belief that Elena had left him without a backward glance. The truth, that she had reached out multiple times, that she had still loved him despite everything, was almost harder to bear. "If I had found that letter," he said slowly, "if I had known where you were, that you wanted space but not necessarily an end to our marriage, everything would have been different." "Perhaps," Elena acknowledged. "Or perhaps you would have made promises that the old Maxwell couldn't have kept." Their eyes met across the table, the unspoken truth hanging between them. The man he had been then would likely have tried to pull her back into his orbit without making the fundamental changes she had needed. It had taken losing her completely, believing her dead, to catalyze his transformation. "What happens now?" Maxwell asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate future. Elena's gaze was steady, unflinching. "That depends on what you do next." "That depends on what you do next." Elena's words echoed in Maxwell's mind as he stood at the window of his hotel room later that night, the Chicago skyline glittering before him like the future, full of possibilities, yet impossible to grasp all at once. What would he do next? The question demanded an answer that would define not just his relationship with Elena, but the man he would become moving forward. His phone vibrated on the nightstand. Maxwell was tempted to ignore it as he had most calls since arriving in Chicago, but something compelled him to check. David's name flashed on the screen. Maxwell answered with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Yes." "Sir, David's normally composed voice wavered. "I think we need to talk. About Elena." A cold clarity washed over Maxwell. "You knew she was alive." The silence on the other end confirmed his suspicion before David responded. "I thought I was protecting you. And the company." "Come to Chicago tomorrow morning." Maxwell ended the call before David could respond, his mind spinning with implications. Had his trusted assistant deliberately kept him from Elena? Had other messages been intercepted, other calls ignored? Sleep eluded him that night as he mentally reconstructed the months following Elena's disappearance. How many times had David filtered his calls, managed his correspondence, controlled access to him in the name of efficiency? The very systems Maxwell had put in place to maximize his productivity had ultimately isolated him from the person who mattered most. By morning, his path forward had crystallized with surprising clarity. When David arrived at his suite looking uncharacteristically disheveled, Maxwell was already dressed and waiting. "Why?" Maxwell asked simply as David took the seat across from him. David's usually impassive face showed signs of a sleepless night. "She called while you were in Tokyo. Said she needed time away. Asked me to tell you she'd reached out." He looked down at his hands. "I saw how her departure had affected you, how you'd thrown yourself into the Tanaka acquisition to avoid dealing with it. We were at a critical juncture. If the deal fell through—" "So you made a decision for me," Maxwell concluded, his voice dangerously quiet. "You decided my marriage was an acceptable sacrifice for the company's success." "I believed you'd made that choice already," David replied, a hint of defiance in his tone. "Every time you chose work over her, every time you missed an anniversary or canceled plans, I was just following your lead." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Maxwell couldn't deny the truth in David's words, which made the betrayal even more painful. He had created the conditions that allowed his assistant to believe such an action was justified. "The letter," Maxwell said. "Did you find it?" David nodded, his shoulders slumping. "In your desk drawer, after she'd been gone a week. I read it, then locked it away. I thought once she'd cooled down, she'd come back on her own. By the time I realized she wouldn't, you'd already started the legal process to have her declared dead. It seemed kinder to let you believe that than to know she'd chosen to leave." Maxwell stood, moving to the window to gather his thoughts. The man behind him had been his right hand for a decade, anticipating his needs, protecting his time, enabling his single-minded focus on building Reed Technologies. Now, he realized that same devotion had cost him everything that truly mattered. "You're fired, David." Maxwell spoke without turning around. "When you return to Boston, submit your resignation citing personal reasons. You'll receive a generous severance package in exchange for your silence about this matter." "Mr. Reed, please." "I don't want your apologies," Maxwell interrupted, finally facing his former assistant. "What's done is done, but I won't have someone I can't trust in my organization. Not anymore." After David left, Maxwell sat at the desk in his suite and began to write. Not emails or acquisition strategies or product development timelines, but a letter to Elena. In it, he poured out everything he couldn't articulate in person. His remorse for the husband he'd been, his grief for the child they'd lost, his understanding of why she'd needed to forge a new path. He wrote about the changes he intended to make, not to win her back, but because they were the right things to do. He would restructure Reed Technologies to prioritize the healthcare initiatives that had been his original passion. He would establish a foundation to support children who had experienced trauma, inspired by her work. He would create a better work-life balance for his employees, having learned firsthand the cost of professional success at the expense of personal happiness. When he finished, he sealed the letter in the hotel stationery envelope and called for a courier to deliver it to Elena's office. He didn't expect a response. This wasn't about rekindling what they had lost, but about proving through actions rather than words that her departure had catalyzed genuine change. For the next 3 days, Maxwell remained in Chicago but didn't contact Elena. Instead, he began implementing the promises he'd made in his letter. He conducted video conferences with his board, outlining a new vision for Reed Technologies that emphasized impact over expansion. He consulted with attorneys about establishing the foundation he'd proposed. He reached out to Ava in Boston, offering her a management position in his company's cafeteria services with flexible hours and benefits that would support her and her son. He was reviewing proposed foundation structures in his hotel room when a knock at the door interrupted his concentration. Maxwell opened it to find Elena standing in the hallway, his letter in her hand. "You're serious about all this," she said, holding up the pages. It wasn't a question, but a realization. "Yes," Maxwell stepped back, inviting her in. "It's long overdue." Elena entered cautiously, her eyes taking in the papers spread across the room's desk, evidence of his efforts to make good on his written promises. "The Foundation for Traumatized Children. You're actually doing it. The paperwork will be finalized next week. I'd like you to consider being on the board of directors given your expertise. No strings attached." Elena raised an eyebrow. "And Reed Technologies? You're really stepping back?" "Stepping back, but not away," Maxwell clarified. "I'm restructuring my role, promoting Jennifer Chen to CEO while I focus on strategic vision and our healthcare initiatives. She's been ready for years. I just couldn't let go of control." Elena sank into one of the room's armchairs, studying him with those perceptive eyes. "And you're doing all this because it's who I always wanted to be before I got lost in the chase for more," Maxwell answered honestly. "Because losing you, believing you were dead, made me confront what truly matters. The changes aren't for you, Elena. They're because of you, but they're for me, for the man I want to be moving forward." Something in his words seemed to reach her. Elena's carefully maintained professional demeanor softened. "I believe you," she said simply. "I can see it in your eyes. You've changed." "Not enough," Maxwell replied. "Not yet, but I'm trying." Elena nodded, then reached into her purse and withdrew a small velvet box. "I found this yesterday while going through some old things. I think it belongs to you now." Maxwell opened the box with trembling fingers. Inside lay his wedding band, the simple gold ring he'd removed during the painful weeks after her disappearance, unable to bear the sight of it. "I took it from your nightstand before I left," Elena explained. I'm not sure why. Maybe some part of me wanted to keep a piece of us, even as I was walking away." Maxwell stared at the ring, emotions washing over him in waves. "You kept this all this time, but gave away the necklace." "The necklace represented what you gave me," Elena said softly. "This represented what I promised you. They were different." Understanding dawned in Maxwell's eyes. "And now, you're returning my promise." Elena's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I'm returning your freedom, Maxwell. We're different people now. The vows we made were to different versions of ourselves." Maxwell closed the box gently. "Thank you for this, for the truth, for everything." They sat in silence for several moments, the air between them charged not with the promise of reunion, but with mutual recognition of all they had been to each other, and all they had lost. "What will you do now?" Elena finally asked. "Stay in Chicago a few more days to finalize the foundation details, then back to Boston to implement the changes at Reed Technologies." Maxwell paused. "And you?" "Continue my work here. The Child Resilience Program is expanding next year. We're developing new protocols for schools to identify trauma responses in children." A genuine smile lit her features as she spoke about her work, reminding Maxwell of the passionate woman he'd fallen in love with so many years ago. "You found your purpose," he observed. "I did. Sometimes we have to lose ourselves to find our way forward." As Elena rose to leave, Maxwell remained seated, understanding that this moment represented not a new beginning, but a necessary ending. They had both found their paths, separate but shaped by their shared history. At the door, Elena turned back. "That waitress, Ava, the one wearing my necklace, is she doing well?" Maxwell smiled. "She is. Her son, too. I offered her a job at Reed Technologies. Better hours, better pay. She starts next month." "I'm glad," Elena said. "The necklace brought her luck after all." "It brought me luck, too," Maxwell replied softly. "It led me to you, not to reclaim what we had, but to finally understand what I lost, to become someone who deserved it in the first place." Elena's eyes glistened with unexpected tears. "Goodbye, Maxwell." "Goodbye, Elena." As the door closed behind her, Maxwell felt not the crushing despair of their first parting, but a bittersweet acceptance. Some loves weren't meant to last forever, but to change you forever. His love for Elena had finally transformed him into the man he'd always wanted to be, just too late for them to share that future together. He opened the velvet box again, running his finger along the smooth gold band inside. Then, with deliberate care, he placed it in his wallet. Not to wear again, but to carry as a reminder of promises broken and lessons learned. Of a love that had been lost, but had ultimately saved him. Outside his window, Chicago continued to pulse with life and possibility. For the first time in years, Maxwell Reed felt ready to truly be part of that life again. 1 year later. The autumn air carried a familiar crispness as Maxwell stepped out of his car at South Station. Boston had entered its most beautiful season, the trees lining the streets painted in vibrant golds and reds. He checked his watch, right on time. Inside, the main hall bustled with the same energy he'd noticed a year earlier when he'd met Ava and Liam on this very spot. How different his life had become since that day. "Mr. Reed." Maxwell turned to see Liam racing toward him, Ava following at a more measured pace. The boy had grown taller in the past year, his face alight with excitement. "Did you bring it? Did you?" Liam bounced on his toes. Maxwell smiled, reaching into his coat pocket. "I did. Fresh off the printer this morning." He handed Liam a small rectangular card. "You're officially the youngest member of the Reed Foundation Junior Advisory Board." Liam beamed at the ID card bearing his name, while Ava approached with a warm smile. "He hasn't talked about anything else for days." "How's the new position working out?" Maxwell asked her. Ava's promotion to food services director had been finalized 3 months ago, her natural leadership abilities quickly proving invaluable. It's challenging, but rewarding. The employee assistance program you implemented has made a real difference for many of the staff. They walked together toward the exit, Liam proudly showing his card to a bemused security guard. The simple joy on the boy's face reminded Maxwell of what truly mattered, the human connections that gave life meaning. "We received the grant proposal from Northwestern yesterday," Ava mentioned as they stepped outside. "Dr. Winter's trauma intervention program looks promising. The board is reviewing it this week." Maxwell nodded, a familiar bittersweet feeling washing over him at the mention of Elena's name. They had spoken occasionally over the past year, professional conversations about the foundation and her research. She had accepted his invitation to submit proposals, but declined a position on the board, maintaining the careful distance they both understood was necessary. "I expect it will be approved," he replied. "Her work deserves support." As they parted ways outside the station, Ava touched his arm gently. "You know, sometimes I look at where my life was before that day at South Station, and I can hardly believe the journey." She fingered the sapphire necklace that still hung around her neck. "One act of kindness changed everything for us." Maxwell smiled, watching Liam skip ahead. "For all of us," he agreed quietly. Later that evening, as Maxwell sat alone in his office reviewing quarterly reports, his phone chimed with an email notification. Elena's name appeared on the screen. "Maxwell, I've just received word about the Foundation's interest in our program. Thank you. The children we work with will benefit immensely from this support. I saw your company's new parental leave policy announced in the Business Journal today. 52 weeks for all employees regardless of position. It's groundbreaking for the tech industry. You're changing lives, Maxwell, including your own, I hope. With respect and gratitude, Elena." Maxwell read the message twice, noting what remained unsaid as much as what was written. There was no mention of reconciliation, no hint of romantic feelings, just recognition of the man he had become, the man he should have been all along. He closed his laptop and moved to the window overlooking the harbor, the same waters where he had once believed Elena's life had ended. Instead, they had both found new beginnings, separate but shaped by their shared past. The sapphire necklace had traveled a circular path, from him to Elena, from Elena to Ava, and finally back to him in the form of a tearful recognition that changed everything. Not by returning to him what he had lost, but by showing him what he needed to find within himself. Maxwell touched the wedding band he still carried in his wallet. Some loves weren't meant to last forever, but their lessons were, and in that knowledge he had finally found peace. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.